It's what, 4 nights that you should find that makes the winter small.
My name is Roberta Slavke, and I'm the director of Olbrich Gardens, and I really want to take a moment to just thank you all for coming and welcome you all to this lecture that I personally am really looking forward to. But first I want to introduce Connie Kloon, who is the president of the Winona Garden Club, who's sponsoring this lecture today, and also Elizabeth K. Royce founded the Winona Garden Club, so we have a whole bunch of connections.
I first met Betty through a collection of, it was actually a rather unassuming cardboard box that arrived at the Botanic Garden at Smith when I was an intern, bearing a Madison return address. And in this box lay 5 remarkable, and in each of these notebooks she recorded her impressions of the garden design philosophy in each of the countries that she visited, described often in great detail the features of the gardens that she toured, and displayed hundreds upon hundreds, 300 at least, of her own photographs. The notebooks ultimately came to reside here in Madison and were carefully stored for decades in the bottom of an old wooden carved chest that was in, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but in Nash and Betty's list. So today I invite you to join me as we journey with Betty through these singular, mesmerizing landscapes, seeing them through her eyes and through the typewritten trail of her cherished notebooks. And before we can begin this journey, we do need to know a little bit more about Elizabeth Royce and the events in her life that made this possible. Elizabeth Kirkland Royce was born in 1905 in Weihai, China. Here you see her as a little girl. She was the first child of Dr. Charles Kirkland Royce and Mabel Milham Royce, Presbyterian missionaries who arrived in China shortly after their marriage in 1904. And here you see Charles and Mabel in 1905, not long after Betty's birth. Betty entered Smith in 1923, where she embarked on a heavily scientific course of study specializing in botany, not surprisingly. And here we see her with friends. She was always an avid fan of the outdoors, and you can see her with friends on the pond at Smith. They've erected some sort of tent on a raft with a campfire and a coffee pot. I'm not sure if it's, you can see. She was scheduled to graduate in 1927, but an entire year spent traveling definitely delayed her progress. It's unclear exactly how her study of Asian gardens came about, but it seems that it was done to some degree in fulfillment of her academic. That's terribly surprising given its importance in her life. China is the largest section. It takes up 2 of the 5 physical notebooks that constitute the collection. And also, she recognized that garden design in Japan and Korea had been influenced by the traditional Chinese garden design, so to pay heed to that. Betty's account of Chinese gardens emphasizes above all else the Chinese love of nature, doubtless because this aspect of Chinese gardens most resonated with her own sensitivity. This was also the environment in which she was born and raised, and the impact of her native landscape can't be overestimated. Certainly, this background influenced her keenly developed appreciation for nature and passion for trees. She would have a lifelong love of the woods, a penchant she seems to have inherited from her father, and her mother's letters home during the trip refer frequently to her daughter's delight in the vegetation and landscape they encountered. Royce states that, quote, "A Chinese garden is made as far as possible to resemble nature, with its hills, miniature lakes nestling at the foot, valley views and vistas, rocky promontories, and flower-filled recesses." In this comment, she reflects the ancient Chinese idea of the garden as a microcosm, a complete portrait of nature enhanced by harmonious contact with man. She stresses the cultural importance of gardening throughout China's long history, the way they thought of it as a fine art, and the garden's interconnection in China with the other fine arts of poetry, calligraphy, and landscape. Hills are an essential element of every Chinese garden, as is water, usually in the form of a lake. In fact, the Chinese word for landscape, shangshui, means hills and waters. Royce observes that most Chinese gardens are small by Western standards, but she discerns observes that it is the clever arrangement of the hills and lakes with continually changing perspectives that creates an impression of limitless space. She would be similarly moved by the peaceful elegance of Japanese gardens. Her account of the gardens of Japan is by far her most poetic, in my opinion, and her photographs, particularly those that she took at the Shinto shrine, the Itsukushima Shinto shrine in Miyajima, are really very poignant and exquisite. I found these to be my favorites in the entire. The purely artistic handling of plant material, water, and rocks seems to have had the greatest impact on Betty, and her appreciation of the high artistry of Japanese gardens permeates the text. I was particularly impressed by her analysis of the dry garden at the Daitokuji Temple in Kyoto. Daisen-in, as the garden is called, is a characteristic example of a sand and stone garden, suggesting the presence of water through the abstract groupings of rocks and shrubs. Quote, "Not a drop of water is used anywhere," she writes, "but so realistic is the effect of the ensemble that one can almost hear the sound of cascading water." In traveling through China and Japan, she was able to clearly distill the key elements of traditional garden design in each culture, but this, however, would not be the case when she visited the gardens of Korea and Siam. Korean gardens are often briefly mentioned in texts in Chinese and Japanese garden design, as the Korean landscape long ago served as the portal through which the Chinese garden tradition reached Japan. Royce perceives this shared design tradition, yet her study of Korean gardens is distinguished primarily by her disappointment in failing to find what she considers to be an authentic Korean-style garden. She similarly discovered that everything old in Korea, including the most traditional estates and gardens, seemed highly influenced by China. Interestingly, she eliminates the Japanese-inspired gardens from her analysis, arguing that they're inauthentic and that the Japanese presence is so recent that she could really only find a characteristic of the capital city Seoul. She is likewise conscious of peasant gardens in the chapter devoted to the gardens of Siam, as Thailand was known when she visited there in 1927. And here's one of the vernacular houses she found inside the country when she was visiting. Soon after her arrival in Siam, she concluded that the most authentic Siamese gardens were those in temples. The Buddhist temples were Wats in the country. She devotes much of her description and many photographs to this Temple of the Emerald Buddha, praising its gleaming white stone and stucco set off by black lacquered windows and doors, brightly colored roof tiles in the shade of ficus trees. Let us hope that Siam in her progress will soon learn to truly appreciate her beautiful old temples and properly care for them. Another haunting portrait of a ruined landscape is found in the final notebook, that devoted to the gardens of India. And here you see the derelict beauty of the deserted palace at Amber. The garden at this palace was built on an island in the middle of a lake below, and it's still, largely architecturally preserved. And Betty writes that at the time she couldn't find any information about it in any of the guidebooks, and today you can find information about these gardens and visit them. In her musings, she encapsulates the two pillars on which Indian garden design is founded: water and architecture. The palace in Amber was considered to be an ideal example of the Rajput style of architecture, which was a kind of a coalescence of Hindu and Muslim design. Studying the gardens of India, she was taking a big step away from the Asian gardens that she'd studied, because here the emphasis is really placed on architecture. This is her plan of the garden of the Taj Mahal, and you can see very clearly the quadripartite nature of it that was essential, because it was inspired by the paradise gardens of Islam, bisected by 4 channels reflecting the symbolic rivers of milk, wine, water, and honey. This collection of 3-ring notebooks was obviously very precious to Betty. Fortunately, for without her documentation, her travels and her observations of these gardens and their creators, as they existed at that key moment in time on the threshold of great change, might be lost. I succeeded in showing my gratitude today for Betty Williams and her extraordinary study, and my thankfulness, which she shared, for the stirring landscapes of Asia and outstanding garden art of